I discovered my girlfriend was keeping her ex's clothes in her closet, and when I confronted her, she said she wasn't ready for anything serious. Sometimes the clearest answers come when you're just looking for a coat hanger. I thought I understood the trajectory Sophia and I were on after 8 months together. I'd been dating Sophia for 8 months, and things seemed to be progressing naturally towards something more serious. I'm a renewable energy systems designer, 29, and I appreciated how Sophia seemed to value stability and planning as much as I did. She worked as a veterinary technician and had this calm, nurturing way about her that made me think we were building toward a real future together. We'd fallen into comfortable routines, talking about weekend trips and making plans that extended weeks into the future, which felt like natural relationship progression to me. I'd been spending most nights at her place in the Arts District, a converted warehouse apartment with exposed brick walls that she'd decorated with plants and vintage furniture that gave the space a warm, lived-in feeling. That Tuesday evening I was looking for hangers in her walk-in closet when I found them. Men's clothes. 3 expensive suits hanging neatly on the left side, dress shirts still in dry cleaning plastic, casual button-downs, even a leather jacket that looked well-worn and personal. The items were hung with care, not stuffed in the back like forgotten belongings, and some still had the subtle scent of cologne that suggested recent use. I recognized the cologne from when Sophia would sometimes smell different after her late work shifts, a woody scent that definitely wasn't mine. I stood there for a moment, processing what I was seeing and feeling my stomach drop as the implications became clear. I called out to Sophia in the kitchen, keeping my voice calm and measured, asking if she had a minute to talk. When I mentioned the men's clothes hanging in her closet and asked who they belonged to, her entire demeanor shifted in a way I'd never seen before. She became defensive immediately, her shoulders tensing as she explained that they belonged to Derek, her ex-boyfriend, and that he just hadn't had time to pick them up yet despite their breakup supposedly being 6 months ago. She insisted it wasn't a big deal and seemed irritated that I was bringing it up, as if I was being unreasonably suspicious about finding another man's wardrobe carefully maintained in my girlfriend's bedroom. The way she said his name, Derek, with a softness that she rarely used when talking about anyone else, told me more than her defensive explanations ever could. I suggested we talk about this properly over dinner rather than having a confrontation in her apartment, and that evening at our favorite Italian restaurant downtown, I decided to address the situation directly rather than let it fester into resentment. The restaurant was busy with its usual Tuesday crowd, and the familiar comfort of our regular corner table made the conversation feel even more surreal. I asked her plainly if she was ready for our relationship to move forward, expecting either reassurance about our future or honest conversation about where we stood. Instead, Sophia fidgeted with a delicate silver bracelet on her wrist, the same one I'd noticed her wearing constantly since we'd started dating, and told me she wasn't ready for anything serious right now. The bracelet caught the light as she twisted it nervously, and I realized it was probably another gift from Derek that she'd never mentioned, just like the cologne I'd been smelling on her clothes. I watched her avoid eye contact while she spoke, looking past me toward the restaurant's front window, and I understood that I'd been sharing space in her life with someone who wasn't actually gone. She talked about needing time to figure things out and not wanting to rush into commitments, using the kind of vague language that people use when they're trying to keep their options open. Rather than arguing or demanding detailed explanations about Derek's ongoing presence in her life, I simply paid the check and suggested we head home, maintaining the same calm demeanor I used during difficult client meetings at work. The drive back to her apartment was quiet except for the radio playing softly, and I found myself thinking about all the small signs I'd probably missed or chosen to ignore over the past few months. That night, I quietly packed my belongings from her apartment while she took a shower, moving through the space methodically and gathering everything that belonged to me. I collected my books from the nightstand, my extra clothes from the drawer she'd cleared for me months ago, the small snake plant I'd brought over because she'd mentioned loving houseplants, and the backup phone charger I'd left permanently plugged in by her bed. I left my spare key on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker we'd used together that morning, along with a brief note that read, "Now you have all the time you need to figure things out," and quietly let myself out. I drove to my brother's house across town, calling him from the car to ask if I could crash on his couch for a few days while I sorted out my living situation. The whole situation felt surreal, Like discovering that what I thought was a solid foundation had actually been built on sand that was slowly shifting beneath my feet. I wasn't angry so much as disappointed that someone I'd grown to care about had been keeping one foot out the door the entire time we were together, maintaining her connection to Derek while letting me believe I was the only man in her emotional life. Sophia initially felt relieved that I'd left without creating drama, but that relief turned to panic when she realized I'd completely disappeared from her life. The morning after I moved out, I blocked her on Instagram, Facebook, and changed my relationship status without any explanation to our mutual friends, something I'd never done in previous breakups but felt necessary this time. I wasn't trying to be vindictive, but I knew from experience that staying connected on social media would only make moving on harder for both of us. I needed clean boundaries to process what had happened and figure out my next steps without the constant temptation to check what she was doing or who she was with. The digital silence was more effective than any dramatic confrontation could have been, creating a void where our daily communication used to exist. Sophia later told me through our mutual friend Carlos that she'd spent the first few days expecting me to call or text, maybe even show up at her apartment to talk things through like couples do in movies. When that didn't happen and she couldn't see any trace of my online activity, she started calling Carlos and our other friends, asking if they'd heard from me and whether I'd said anything about our breakup. The panic in her voice was apparently obvious to everyone, though I only learned about this weeks later when Carlos mentioned it during one of our workout sessions at the gym. She'd gone from feeling in control of the situation to completely cut off from any information about my emotional state or future plans, which left her scrambling to understand what had actually happened between us. Meanwhile, her best friend Allison had started dropping uncomfortable truths that Sophia wasn't ready to hear, but needed to confront if she wanted to understand why both relationships had imploded simultaneously. Allison revealed that Derek had been seen around town with another woman for the past month, a brunette who worked at the downtown marketing firm, and that several of Sophia's coworkers had been gossiping about her keeping both Derek and me on what they called emotional standby. The veterinary clinic where Sophia worked was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and apparently her pattern of maintaining connections with multiple men hadn't gone unnoticed by her colleagues. Allison told her bluntly that people had been wondering when Sophia would finally choose between Derek and me, and some had even started placing informal bets on which relationship would end first. This revelation hit Sophia harder than losing me had, because it meant her carefully managed situation had been transparent to everyone except the two men involved. The humiliation of knowing that her coworkers had been watching her juggle two relationships like some kind of workplace soap opera forced her to confront the reality of her behavior in a way she'd been avoiding for months. I started staying with my brother Jake in his spare bedroom while apartment hunting, grateful for his no-questions-asked support during what could have been a much more dramatic transition. Jake worked in construction and had a straightforward way of looking at relationships that I found comforting during those first confusing weeks. He pointed out that anyone who keeps their ex's belongings after 6 months isn't actually over that person, and that I'd probably saved myself years of wondering where I stood in Sophia's priorities. His practical perspective helped me see the situation clearly without getting lost in the emotional complexity that Sophia seemed to thrive on. I threw myself into work, focusing on a major solar panel installation project for a local nonprofit organization that provided energy-efficient housing for low-income families. The project required longer hours and more detailed coordination than usual, which gave me a productive outlet for the restless energy that comes with major life changes. Working with my hands and seeing tangible progress on something meaningful felt therapeutic after months of trying to navigate an unclear relationship situation. I started avoiding our usual hangout spots in the arts district, choosing different coffee shops and restaurants to minimize the chance of awkward encounters while my emotions were still raw. The physical distance helped me realize how much of my social life had become centered around Sophia's preferences and friend group, and I began reconnecting with colleagues and old friends I'd somewhat neglected during our relationship. I discovered that I'd been unconsciously modifying my routines and choices to accommodate someone who wasn't even fully committed to our future together. When Sophia finally worked up the courage to call Derek and ask him to pick up his belongings, expecting some kind of emotional conversation or reconciliation discussion, he casually mentioned that he'd been seeing someone new for several weeks. He acted genuinely surprised that she'd thought they might get back together, telling her he'd assumed she understood their breakup was permanent when he'd started dating again months ago. Derek's casual dismissal of any potential reunion left Sophia facing the reality that she'd lost both relationships through her own indecision and inability to commit fully to either man. The belongings that had caused such turmoil in my relationship with her turned out to be nothing more than forgotten items that Derek had simply been too busy or indifferent to collect, not the meaningful connection she'd been preserving in her mind. The conversation with Derek stripped away all the romantic illusions she'd been maintaining about their past relationship and forced her to acknowledge that she'd been holding on to a fantasy while sabotaging something real with me. I found a modern loft apartment near the University District within 3 weeks. A clean space with large windows and exposed brick that felt like a fresh start rather than a consolation prize. The apartment search had been surprisingly therapeutic, giving me concrete goals and decisions to make while processing the emotional aftermath of discovering how little I'd actually known about my relationship with Sophia. The loft was on the 3rd floor of a converted textile factory, with 12-foot ceilings and enough space for a proper home office where I could work on renewable energy project designs in the evenings. I threw myself into a major solar panel installation project for a local nonprofit organization that was converting an old warehouse into affordable housing units, working longer hours to avoid dwelling on the relationship and finding genuine satisfaction in creating something sustainable and meaningful. The project required coordinating with electricians, roofers, and city inspectors, which kept my mind occupied during what could have been much more difficult weeks of overthinking and second-guessing my decision to leave. Working with my hands and seeing tangible progress on something that would help families reduce their energy costs felt therapeutic after months of trying to navigate relationship dynamics that seemed to shift without warning or explanation. Sophia was going through her own reckoning during those same weeks, finally clearing Derek's belongings from her apartment in what she later described to Allison as a tearful purging session that felt like admitting defeat on multiple levels. She packed his expensive suits, dress shirts, and that leather jacket into boxes with the same methodical precision I'd used when gathering my own things, but unlike my quiet departure, hers was accompanied by hours of crying and the painful realization that she'd been clinging to items that represented a relationship that had ended months ago in Derek's mind. The process forced her to finally admit to herself that she'd been using me as emotional security while hoping Derek would return, a pattern she'd been unconsciously following for most of our relationship without acknowledging the unfairness to either of us. She had to confront the reality that she'd been living in a fantasy where she could maintain connections with both of us indefinitely, never having to make a real choice or face the possibility of being truly alone. When she attempted to reach out to me through Carlos, asking him to tell me she wanted to talk and explain her side of things, he politely relayed her message but also conveyed my response that I was focusing on my career and didn't want any contact. I'd asked Carlos to be kind but clear that I needed space to move forward, and while I appreciated that she wanted to provide explanations or apologies, I wasn't emotionally ready to rehash a situation that I'd already processed and accepted. The finality of my response hit Sophia harder than she'd expected, because it meant she couldn't gradually work her way back into my life or maintain the kind of ambiguous connection she'd been comfortable with in other relationships. She'd been hoping for the possibility of friendship or eventual reconciliation, but my complete withdrawal forced her to accept that some decisions have permanent consequences. Sophia started therapy around this time, finally recognizing that she had a pattern of keeping backup relationships and avoiding full commitment that had sabotaged multiple promising partnerships over the years. Her therapist helped her understand that her fear of being alone had driven her to maintain emotional safety nets that prevented her from experiencing genuine intimacy or building the kind of stable relationship she claimed to want. The sessions were difficult because they required her to examine behaviors she'd been unconsciously repeating since college, always keeping multiple romantic options available rather than investing fully in one person and risking genuine vulnerability. I began training for a half marathon and joined a local cycling group that met on weekend mornings, activities that gave me goals completely unrelated to romantic relationships and helped me rebuild my social life around shared interests rather than couple-based activities. The cycling group included people from various backgrounds and age groups, and I found myself looking forward to our Saturday rides through the hills outside the city, conversations about gear and routes and weekend plans that had nothing to do with relationship drama or emotional complexity. The physical challenge of training for longer distances was exactly what I needed, providing measurable progress and clear goals that contrasted sharply with the ambiguous situation I'd been trying to navigate with Sophia. The physical distance between our new routines meant Sophia and I rarely crossed paths, which allowed both of us to begin genuine healing without the constant possibility of awkward encounters that might have prolonged the emotional recovery process. I discovered that I'd been unconsciously limiting my activities and social connections to accommodate Sophia's schedule and preferences, and now I had the freedom to explore interests and friendships that I'd been neglecting without realizing it. My work performance improved noticeably during this period, as I channeled my energy into professional development and took on additional responsibilities that positioned me for future promotions within the renewable energy sector that had always been my passion. I started attending industry conferences and networking events that I'd previously skipped because Sophia had preferred staying in on weekends, and I began to remember what it felt like to pursue my own interests without constantly considering someone else's comfort level or approval. 6 months later, I met Valentina at a green building conference where she was documenting my team's innovative solar roof design for a sustainability magazine. I was presenting our latest project, a residential complex that achieved net zero energy consumption through integrated solar panels and smart grid technology, when I noticed a woman with professional photography equipment capturing detailed shots of our installation from multiple angles. She approached me after my presentation, introducing herself as a freelance architectural photographer who specialized in sustainable design projects, and asked if she could interview me about the technical aspects of our solar integration for an upcoming article about renewable energy in residential construction. Her questions demonstrated genuine understanding of the engineering principles behind renewable energy systems, and I found myself explaining complex concepts with enthusiasm rather than the polite tolerance I'd grown accustomed to when discussing my work with people who weren't genuinely interested. Valentina had an immediate curiosity about the engineering behind sustainable building practices that reminded me how much I'd missed having conversations about work that went beyond surface-level politeness. Our connection developed naturally over shared interests in environmental design and travel photography, topics that had never come up in my relationship with Sophia, who'd always seemed politely bored when I talked about renewable energy innovations or my professional goals. Valentina appreciated my emotional honesty and clear communication about relationship expectations, something I'd learned to value after the confusion and ambiguity I'd experienced with Sophia's inability to commit or communicate her actual feelings. When I told Valentina about my previous relationship and how it had ended, she appreciated my directness about needing clear boundaries and mutual commitment in any serious partnership, rather than viewing my honesty as emotional baggage or excessive intensity. She shared her own experiences with relationships where communication had been unclear, and we both agreed that we preferred direct conversations about expectations rather than trying to guess what the other person was thinking or wanting. We started meeting for coffee to discuss her photography projects and my ongoing work with sustainable housing developments, conversations that often stretched for hours because we both enjoyed the intellectual connection and shared passion for environmental responsibility. Our early dates involved visits to green building projects around the city, where Valentina would photograph innovative design elements while I explained the technical systems that made them environmentally efficient. Sophia had been focusing on her own growth during those same months, working with her therapist to understand her patterns and taking ceramics classes as a way to stay present and creative without the pressure of romantic relationships. The pottery classes gave her something to do with her hands while processing the emotional work of therapy, and she found genuine satisfaction in creating functional objects from clay, a process that required patience and attention to detail that she'd never developed in her romantic life. Her instructor, an older woman named Margaret, encouraged students to focus on the present moment rather than worrying about the final product, a philosophy that Sophia was trying to apply to her life in general after years of constantly planning escape routes from her relationships. For the first time since college, Sophia was living independently without anyone's belongings cluttering her space or emotional bandwidth, and she was slowly learning to appreciate the peace that came with not constantly managing multiple relationships or trying to keep her options open. She started dating occasionally but took things slowly, practicing the boundary-setting skills she'd learned in therapy and being upfront about her need for gradual relationship development rather than rushing into the kind of intense connection that had led her to keep backup plans in the past. Her therapist had helped her recognize that her fear of commitment stemmed from a deeper fear of vulnerability, and that maintaining multiple relationships had been a way of protecting herself from ever having to risk being completely rejected by someone she truly cared about. The work was difficult because it required her to examine her relationship with her parents, who had divorced when she was 12, and how their contentious separation had influenced her own approach to romantic partnerships. Valentina and I began traveling together to photograph sustainable architecture projects, combining her professional assignments with my interest in innovative environmental design, creating a partnership that supported both our careers while allowing us to explore shared interests. Our first trip together was to Portland, where she had been commissioned to document a net-zero office building that used cutting-edge solar technology, and I was able to provide technical context for her photographs while learning about different approaches to renewable energy implementation. Our relationship progressed steadily as we supported each other's professional goals, with Valentina encouraging me to present at more conferences and pursue leadership opportunities within the renewable energy sector that I'd been hesitant to take on during my relationship with Sophia. She understood the demands of my work because her own freelance career required similar dedication and travel, and rather than feeling neglected when I worked late on project proposals, she often used those evenings to edit photographs or work on her own assignments. The balance we found felt natural and sustainable in a way that my relationship with Sophia never had, built on mutual respect for each other's professional ambitions rather than one person constantly adapting to accommodate the other's limitations or emotional needs. We established clear communication patterns early in our relationship, checking in regularly about our schedules, expectations, and feelings rather than assuming the other person could read our minds or guess what we needed. A year and a half after our breakup, Valentina and I attended a sustainable living expo where Sophia was volunteering with an animal rescue organization, leading to an awkward but civil brief conversation that reinforced how much both our lives had changed. I spotted Sophia first, working at a booth promoting foster programs for senior dogs, wearing a volunteer t-shirt and talking animatedly with potential adopters about the rewards of giving older animals a second chance. She looked genuinely engaged in her work, more present and focused than I'd ever seen her during our relationship, when she'd often seemed distracted by her phone or other possibilities. The woman working alongside her introduced herself as the rescue coordinator and praised Sophia's dedication to the senior dog program, mentioning that she'd been volunteering consistently for over 6 months and had personally fostered 3 older dogs who had eventually found permanent homes. When she noticed Valentina and me approaching the booth, her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly and greeted us with professional politeness that felt surprisingly comfortable given our history. I introduced Valentina naturally without any tension, explaining that she was documenting the expo for an environmental magazine and was interested in photographing the intersection between animal welfare and sustainable living practices. Sophia gracefully congratulated us on what was obviously a serious relationship, mentioning that she could see how happy we looked together, and shared that she'd been focusing on expanding the rescue's foster program for animals with special needs. She spoke passionately about the senior dogs in their care, explaining how older animals often got overlooked despite being well-trained and grateful for attention, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen her talk about something with genuine enthusiasm that wasn't related to her own personal desires or romantic relationships. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like a significant milestone because there was no underlying drama or unresolved tension, just 2 people who had once been important to each other acknowledging that they'd both moved forward in positive directions. Valentina asked thoughtful questions about the rescue's sustainability initiatives, showing genuine interest in their efforts to use eco-friendly products and reduce waste, which led to a natural conversation about environmental responsibility that included all 3 of us without any awkwardness. The encounter reinforced for me how much I'd grown in my ability to choose partners who aligned with my values, as I watched Valentina genuinely engage with Sophia about animal rescue work and sustainable pet care practices without any jealousy or possessiveness. Valentina's confidence in our relationship and her natural warmth towards someone from my past showed me the difference between secure attachment and the anxious uncertainty I'd experienced with Sophia's inability to fully commit to our future. I noticed how Valentina maintained appropriate boundaries while being genuinely friendly, never feeling threatened by my history with someone else because she was secure in what we'd built together. Sophia recognized how much healthier I looked with someone who clearly prioritized our relationship, and I could see in her eyes a mixture of regret and genuine happiness for the stability I'd found. She mentioned that therapy had helped her understand her own patterns better and that she was learning to appreciate gradual relationship building, which suggested she'd been doing the emotional work necessary to change her approach to romantic partnerships. After we walked away from the booth, Valentina mentioned that Sophia seemed like she was in a much better place emotionally than the person I described from our relationship, which led to a conversation about how people can grow and change when they're motivated to address their patterns. We talked about how the version of Sophia I'd dated had been caught in anxiety about commitment and vulnerability, but the woman we'd just met seemed more grounded and present, focused on contributing to something meaningful rather than just managing her own emotional needs. Sophia later told her therapist about feeling genuinely happy for me despite a twinge of regret, describing the encounter as a significant milestone in her emotional growth because she hadn't felt the urge to compete or try to reclaim my attention. Her therapist pointed out that being able to wish an ex-partner well without feeling threatened or diminished was a sign of genuine progress in her ability to form healthy relationships. The brief interaction had also shown Sophia how different I was with someone who matched my energy and commitment level, reinforcing her understanding that our incompatibility hadn't been about either of us being fundamentally flawed, but about us wanting different things at different stages of our personal development. She realized that the stability and clear communication she'd found overwhelming with me were exactly what had allowed me to build something lasting with Valentina. Both Valentina and I realized that we'd become different people who were better equipped for committed relationships, as evidenced by our ability to handle an unexpected encounter with my ex without drama or insecurity. The ease with which we navigated the situation, discussing it openly afterward and supporting each other through any lingering emotions, demonstrated the kind of partnership I'd always wanted but hadn't known how to recognize or maintain. Sophia's volunteer work with the animal rescue had given her a sense of purpose that didn't depend on romantic relationships, and she was learning to find fulfillment in contributing to something larger than her own emotional needs. She'd been working specifically with senior dogs who had been surrendered by families who couldn't care for them anymore, and the experience had taught her about the importance of commitment and seeing relationships through difficult periods rather than abandoning them when they became challenging. The parallel between her work with abandoned animals and her own pattern of abandoning relationships wasn't lost on her, and she'd been using these insights in therapy to understand her fear of being the one who gets left behind. Working with the rescue had also connected her with other volunteers who shared her values about caring for vulnerable creatures, providing her with a social network that wasn't centered around dating or romantic possibilities. 2 years after our breakup, Valentina and I moved in together and adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, creating the kind of stable, future-focused partnership that I'd wanted all along. Our shared apartment was a larger space in the same neighborhood where I'd found my loft, with enough room for both our professional equipment and a dedicated office where we could work on projects together. The apartment reflected both our personalities equally, with Valentina's photography equipment coexisting naturally with my cycling gear and renewable energy project models, creating a home that felt balanced and intentional rather than one person adapting to accommodate the other's lifestyle. We'd chosen the apartment together after months of looking, discussing our individual needs and shared preferences without the kind of compromise that leaves one person feeling diminished or overlooked. We'd chosen Charlie from the animal rescue where we'd encountered Sophia, specifically requesting an older dog who needed patience and consistent care, and the adoption process had reinforced how well we worked together when making important decisions about our shared future. Charlie was an 8-year-old golden retriever mix whose previous family had surrendered him when they moved to an apartment that didn't allow pets, and his gentle nature and well-trained behavior made him an ideal companion for our busy professional schedules. The rescue coordinator mentioned that Charlie had been returned once before by a family who'd underestimated the commitment required for an older dog with mild arthritis, but his sweet temperament and house training made him perfect for people who understood that caring for a living creature required long-term dedication. Having Charlie together gave us a shared responsibility that deepened our commitment to each other, as we coordinated his care around our work travel and photography assignments, learning to plan our schedules with another living being's needs in mind. Our morning routine involved taking Charlie for walks through the neighborhood before work, and our evening routine included longer walks that gave us time to decompress from our days while ensuring he got adequate exercise for his age and health needs. Sophia had been dating Andrew, a fellow veterinary professional, for 6 months and was practicing the healthy communication patterns she'd learned in therapy, being clear about her feelings and timeline from the start rather than maintaining the ambiguous connections that had characterized her previous relationships. Andrew worked as a veterinary surgeon at the same animal hospital where one of Sophia's rescue colleagues had a part-time job, and their introduction had come through their shared professional interest in animal welfare rather than through dating apps or social situations focused primarily on romantic connections. Sophia appreciated that Andrew understood the emotional demands of working with animals and didn't pressure her for commitments she wasn't ready to make, allowing their relationship to develop at a pace that felt comfortable for both of them. She'd been upfront with Andrew about her pattern of keeping backup relationships and her work in therapy to address those behaviors, and he'd appreciated her honesty rather than being scared off by her self-awareness about past mistakes. Their conversations about relationship expectations happened naturally over dinner or during walks with foster animals, creating opportunities for honest discussion without the formal pressure of relationship talks that had made Sophia anxious in previous partnerships. Their dates often involved activities related to their shared work with animals, visiting adoption events or hiking with foster dogs, which gave them natural opportunities to observe each other's values and character in action rather than just in conversation. Andrew had noticed how Sophia interacted with the senior dogs at the rescue, showing patience with their slower movements and special needs, and her compassion for vulnerable animals had been one of the qualities that initially attracted him to her beyond their professional compatibility. When she learned through Carlos that Valentina and I were engaged, Sophia felt a complex mix of happiness for me and sadness for her past self, but no desire to reach out or interfere with the life I was building with someone who clearly appreciated the same qualities that had made our relationship feel overwhelming to her. She told Andrew about my engagement when they were walking through the park with one of her foster dogs, explaining our history and how seeing my growth had reinforced her commitment to doing her own emotional work rather than falling back into old patterns. Andrew listened without judgment and pointed out that her ability to feel genuinely happy for an ex-partner showed significant emotional maturity, something he'd learned to value after his own previous relationship had ended with bitter resentment and ongoing drama. His ex-girlfriend had struggled with jealousy about his previous relationships and had demanded that he cut contact with anyone he'd ever dated, which had created an atmosphere of suspicion and control that eventually destroyed their connection. Sophia focused on her own relationship with Andrew, who appreciated her growth and didn't pressure her for commitments she wasn't ready to make, understanding that she was learning to build trust gradually rather than rushing into intense connections that felt unsustainable. Their relationship was developing with the kind of intentional pacing that Sophia had never experienced before, with regular conversations about their expectations and feelings rather than the assumption-based communication that had characterized her past relationships. Andrew had his own history of relationship challenges, including a previous engagement that had ended when he and his ex-fiancée realized they wanted different lifestyles, and his experience had taught him the importance of compatibility in values and life goals rather than just romantic attraction. The stability that Valentina and I had built together felt like a natural progression of our shared interests and clear communication, rather than the forced timeline that had characterized my attempts to move forward with Sophia when she wasn't emotionally available for the kind of partnership I was seeking. Our engagement announcement was simple and focused on our excitement about building a future together, with photos from a hiking trip where we'd both been documenting renewable energy installations in remote locations for one of Valentina's magazine assignments. The proposal itself had happened naturally during a sunset break from photographing a wind farm, with the ring I'd been carrying for weeks finally finding the perfect moment when we were both reflecting on how our professional collaboration had evolved into something much deeper and more meaningful. 3 years later, Valentina and I had a small outdoor wedding at a botanical garden, with our ceremony incorporating solar-powered lighting and locally sourced flowers that reflected our shared environmental values. The venue was perfect for us, with native plant gardens that provided natural backdrops for Valentina's photographer friends who documented our day, and renewable energy systems that powered the reception area where we celebrated with family and close friends. We'd spent months planning the wedding together, making decisions that reflected both our personalities rather than following traditional expectations that didn't align with our values or relationship style. The guest list included colleagues from both our professional fields, cycling friends from my weekend group, volunteers from the animal rescue where we'd adopted Charlie, and family members who had watched our relationship develop with genuine appreciation for how well-matched we were. Our vows focused on supporting each other's professional growth and continuing to build a partnership based on clear communication and shared goals, with promises that felt authentic to who we were as individuals and as a couple rather than generic romantic language that didn't capture our actual relationship dynamics. Charlie served as our ring bearer, wearing a bow tie that matched our color scheme and walking down the aisle with the kind of dignified patience that had made him such a perfect addition to our family. The ceremony felt intimate and meaningful rather than performative, with readings from environmental poets and a unity ritual involving planting a tree that we could nurture together for decades to come. Our wedding photographer captured moments that showed our genuine happiness and comfort with each other, images that would remind us of the joy we felt in choosing to build our lives together intentionally and thoughtfully. Sophia attended the Animal Rescue's annual fundraiser the same weekend, working alongside Andrew to coordinate adoption events and feeling fulfilled by their partnership in both personal and professional spheres. The fundraiser was held at a local park where rescue organizations from across the region brought animals available for adoption, and Sophia had been coordinating the senior dog showcase that highlighted older animals who needed patient families willing to provide end-of-life care. She and Andrew had been working together for months to develop a program that paired senior dogs with elderly adopters, creating mutually beneficial relationships where older people gained companionship while providing loving homes for dogs who might otherwise be overlooked. Their collaboration on the program had shown Sophia what it felt like to build something meaningful with a partner who shared her values and commitment level, rather than constantly managing someone else's emotional availability or trying to guess their level of interest in shared projects. The fundraiser had raised more money than ever before, and Sophia felt genuine pride in her contribution to something larger than her individual needs, a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years of focusing primarily on romantic relationships and personal security. She'd learned to appreciate gradual relationship building and no longer kept emotional backup plans, having developed the confidence to be alone rather than settle for unclear situations that left her constantly anxious about where she stood. Andrew appreciated her dedication to the rescue work and her ability to organize volunteers and coordinate complex events, skills that translated well to their personal relationship where they'd learned to plan together and communicate about both small daily decisions and larger life goals. The success of their collaborative project had strengthened their personal bond while giving them shared accomplishment that existed independently of their romantic connection, creating the kind of foundation that allowed their relationship to feel stable and purposeful. Valentina and I honeymooned in Costa Rica photographing eco-lodges and sustainable tourism projects, building our shared business while strengthening our marriage during our first weeks as husband and wife. The trip combined work with pleasure perfectly, as we documented innovative environmental practices at resorts that were pioneering low-impact tourism while experiencing the country's incredible biodiversity and conservation efforts. We spent our days hiking through cloud forests and photographing solar-powered accommodations, and our evenings reviewing the day's work and planning future projects that would allow us to continue traveling together for professional reasons. The honeymoon reinforced how well our personal and professional lives integrated, with shared goals that made our marriage feel like a natural expansion of the partnership we'd already built rather than a dramatic change in our relationship dynamics. We returned home with not only beautiful memories but also a portfolio of work that would lead to future assignments and establish us as a team specializing in sustainable tourism documentation. Both Sophia and I had found relationships that honored our growth and learned that real love requires choosing each other clearly and consistently, without keeping one foot out the door or maintaining backup options that prevent full emotional investment. The contrast between my marriage to Valentina and my previous relationship with Sophia couldn't have been clearer, as I experienced the peace that comes from being with someone who wants the same future and is willing to do the work required to build it together. Sophia's relationship with Andrew was teaching her similar lessons about commitment and vulnerability, as she practiced staying present in difficult conversations rather than planning escape routes or keeping other options available as emotional insurance against potential rejection. We had both learned that meaningful relationships require the willingness to be fully seen and known by another person, rather than keeping parts of ourselves hidden or maintaining the kind of emotional distance that had characterized our relationship with each other years earlier. The growth we'd each experienced individually had prepared us for the kind of partnerships we'd always claimed to want but hadn't been emotionally ready to sustain when we were together.